Good morning. Welcome to today's educational webinar on noise exposure and hearing loss. My name is Ryan Bast of the Motor Safety Association. You may have noted that all microphones are muted at this time, except mine, and those microphones will remain muted throughout the duration of the webinar. However, if you do have any questions, please enter them into the chat box, and at the conclusion of the webinar, I will go through all of the questions and send the responses to the webinar attendees. So some of the items that we will discuss in today's webinar include a disclaimer and introduction to noise exposure and hearing loss, as well as the legislation applicable in Saskatchewan. I'll go through responsibilities, as well as leave you with tips on prevention of keeping your hearing protection and preserving your hearing. I'll also highlight the methods that we utilize to measure sound and go through the frequently asked questions section of the webinar. And we will conclude with a hearing conservation program. There are also many sample templates that webinar attendees will receive once the webinar concludes, so you don't have to madly rush and write things down as we go through the webinar, as you will receive these nicely bundled up in an email once the webinar concludes. As well as this webinar will be uploaded to our website very soon as well, once the webinar wraps up. So the webinar today discusses noise exposure and hearing loss. This information is theory only. It's not a substitution for a hearing protection program or conservation program or testing. This just gives you some theory information around requirements and legislation and responsibilities in your workplace. So let's start off with what exactly is noise. Noise is defined as unwanted sound, and it's measured in dBA, also known as decibels. And when we look at noise being unwanted sound, sound is in fact a form of energy in pressure variation that the human ear can detect. And one of those things that we can detect which causes damage is sound over time, which gives noise-induced hearing loss. And unfortunately, this is a very common occupational health hazard, which is incurable. However, by preserving and protecting our hearing, we can prevent this type of noise-induced hearing loss. And I hope to give you some tips that you can take home from this webinar on how we can preserve our hearing. But can you relate to any of these situations on the slide? For example, do people have to raise their voice to talk to you when they're only 1 meter away? Or at the end of the work shift, do you have to turn your radio louder so that it's uncomfortable for others, but now you can hear it? Or after working years in a specific workplace, do you find other sounds that may be hard to communicate or hear, more so than people around you that you're associated with? So if any of these are concerns or that you can relate to, you may want to ensure that you've had your hearing tested or your workplace tested as well for what the noise exposures are. And just to give you an idea of some common noise levels, I found a chart that has a vertical line drawn through it at 85 dBA or decibels. And this is just a guide. This isn't a scientific type of measurement because all different items on the left can be slightly different in decibel levels, but this gives you a general idea. So anything in red exceeds the 85 dBA mark. So as you can see, a lot of the items that we're exposed to are in greater than 85 dBA. So this gives you a good idea. Another thing that sometimes is missed from equations when we're looking at decibel exposure is the actual exposure time that people are exposed to these noise sources with. So you may be exposed to a combine or, for example, a table saw for a short period of time, but the longer you are exposed to it gives you more hearing damage. So it's some of these items right around that threshold. The exposure time can greatly impact hearing loss. And I'll be talking about that coming up in the webinar. In this slide, you will see what the various dBA exposure does. From 75 to 84 dBA, minor hearing loss may develop in people with sensitive hearing. At 85 dBA, permanent hearing loss in approximately 8% of repeatedly exposed workers. When we go up to 90 dBA, we're up to approximately 25% of repeatedly exposed workers can suffer permanent hearing loss. And as that dBA level rises, we experience pain and discomfort to eventually permanent damage of our eardrums. So again, this gives you an idea of where this damage can occur at based on these levels. And when we talk about decibels, dBA, another equation that we need to be aware of is dBA lex, as the lex value tells the rest of the story, as it takes into account workers' exposure time over an 8-hour shift. So we utilize a lex value chart, and with this chart, we measure the dBA exposure as well as look at the exposure time someone is using this piece of equipment or they're exposed to a certain item, and then we're able to determine what that lex value is. And if you don't have a lex value chart, it will be sent to all attendees. And why I bring this up is in Saskatchewan, the legislation speaks to decibel as well as dBA lex. And just to go through that legislation, at 80 dBA, you have to have your noise levels tested. If you're unsure if you have 80 dBA in your workplace, a good idea is to have someone come out and test it. And for our members in Saskatchewan, we offer the sound level testing at no additional charge. When you are above 80 dBA lex to 85 dBA lex, you need to inform workers of noise hazards, provide hearing protection, and train the worker on the selection, use, and maintenance of the hearing protection. And once we have higher exposures, such as 90 dBA or 85 dBA lex equal or greater, we still need to inform workers of the noise hazards, provide hearing protection, train the workers on the selection, use, and maintenance of hearing protection. And this item sometimes gets missed. Sometimes people say, do I really need to train workers? Hearing protection is very simple. But I see so much of the disposable plugs are just about falling out of the people's ears. They're not wearing them correctly. So the training component is a big piece of this as well. Also, when you're in this 90 dBA to 85 dBA lex equal or greater, take reasonable steps to reduce noise and minimize exposure. I've got some tips coming up on that, as well as to arrange for the audiometric testing to be done at least once every 2 years. And we'll be speaking to that component as well. So again, this is information that comes right out of the Saskatchewan regulations, and a complete copy of the applicable noise conservation regulations will be sent out to the attendees as well. I'll talk a bit about the responsibility piece now. Employers' responsibilities ensure that the lowest possible noise levels are at the facility. So by having our noise levels tested and measured, we can see where those sources of noise are coming from and ensure that we are utilizing the lowest levels possible. A good example of this was I've just recently inspected a brand new automotive dealership just built, and the builder had put in a circulation fan. And when this fan fired up, it was coming out between 85 and 90 dBA. This was something that was missed when they procured this type of equipment. But now that it's in place, they're going to look at ways of trying to enclose the fan while still allowing for circulation, because they aren't going to change it out, that they just put it into place. But again, keep those things in mind, ensuring noise levels are at the lowest possible in the facility, and implementing reasonable measures to reduce this noise. Informing workers of the noise levels. So that's the piece where you're having the noise levels tested and you're sharing those results. Could be at a toolbox talk or a safety meeting or a staff meeting. Selecting and providing hearing protection at no cost to the worker. Again, if required, based on the decibel exposure. And ensuring that audiometric testing is done if the exposure limit qualifies for that. So those are some of the employer responsibilities. Next up, the supervisor responsibilities are following up to ensure equipment is maintained properly. So sometimes we may bring a piece of equipment into our organization, but over time and perhaps as the machine wears, it can become louder, producing excessive noise. Or sometimes people remove mufflers from air tools, and therefore it produces excessive noise. So again, those are some of the supervisor responsibilities to ensure that equipment is maintained and not producing excessive noise. The supervisor can train the workers on how to use, store, and maintain the hearing protection, or bring in someone like us, or utilize videos and practical demonstrations for this training to occur for the hearing protection. And also to coach workers on the importance of wearing hearing protection. So I use the word coaching, so we can speak to someone and tell them that it's important to wear hearing protection because we want to be able to hear our grandchildren when we're older, or be able to hear and have a good quality of life. This goes a long way when we're trying to understand why the hearing protection is required, and it's just explaining it to people. And the flip side of that is the next point. Once we've went through that coaching piece, well, we still need to enforce our hearing protection rule or policy and to ensure people are wearing it and protecting their hearing. The workers' responsibilities include following the training provided, utilizing that training and wearing the PPE, and following the rule or policy set out by the employer. Also, the worker needs to notify the supervisor if their hearing protection becomes defective, perhaps if the earmuffs are damaged and they're not sealing up properly anymore, or the equipment that they're using is now generating higher noise levels. This type of information needs to be communicated. And keep in mind, using, storing, and maintaining the hearing protection as required is another worker responsibility. So how do we prevent noise exposure? The best case scenario is right at the source. So again, when you're procuring items, don't just look at the price. Look at the dBA level and utilize that once you get into the facility. Another example is a good opportunity is if you have a piece of equipment, perhaps between the workers and the path or the source of that noise, we can in fact put controls in along the path to reduce that noise exposure. And lastly, we can rely on hearing protection to keep the workers safe and protect their hearing. But dealing with an item at the source and along the path are better controls. So for example, if I have an air compressor that's 100 dBA and it's located at the center of our shop, it's going to be affecting everyone in that shop because it's centrally located and it's 100 dBA. If I were to relocate that to the corner and perhaps look at some practical solutions, including enclosures or barriers, that will help muffle and reduce that noise. So we've relocated it and we've tried to control this noise by putting a barrier around it. So again, that's another way of dealing with it. So if we're not going to replace that air compressor, we can use what we have and try to relocate and muffle that noise. Also on this slide, you'll see various other tips of ways that you can use to prevent noise exposure in the workplace. So once we've exercised trying to control the noise at the source, trying to control noise along the path, such as what we've seen on this here slide, at that point, it still may be necessary to use hearing protection after we've tried all of those other opportunities. And hearing protection should only be used as an interim measure until you can permanently engineer out the noise if possible. However, if you cannot possibly eliminate the noise, that's when you would need to wear hearing protection. And hearing protection is a last resort. But unfortunately, I personally believe sometimes we use it as a first resort. We sometimes don't look at controlling the noise at the source and at the path, and we put out hearing protection and utilize that to keep our workers' exposure rates down and prevent hearing loss. And sometimes we may miss the big picture of trying to control the noise. Because if we don't wear that hearing protection correctly, it's going to provide very little protection. And that protection rating of hearing protection is itemized as the NRR rating, is what it's known as. So what exactly is an NRR rating or noise reduction rating? That's basically the measurement used to determine the effectiveness of hearing protection. Some may call it a ruler or the measurement to determine how well that hearing protection may work. And keep in mind, it's only going to work as well as the way that it's installed. So if I've installed or put in disposable hearing protection and I didn't install it correctly, my NRR rating is going to be greatly reduced. So that's why we can't just rely on hearing protection, because it's only as effective if it's worn correctly. But keep in mind, just look at that NRR rating when you are purchasing hearing protection. Which is a good segue into our next slides, looking at the different hearing protection types. You want to ensure first off that any hearing protection you buy is approved, that it meets a standard, whether it be CSA or ANSI. It needs to have been tested and proven. Again, look at that NRR rating. What you see on this slide are disposable plugs. And with these, be sure that you follow the direction on the package to insert these properly. As I said before, a lot of times I see these that are hanging out of the ears and just the tips of them are in. So therefore, they're not giving you a very effective NRR rating. And a good tip with these are not to reuse this type of disposable hearing protection. The next type are molded plugs. And molded plugs are built to fit the worker. A custom molded earplug is a laboratory-made earplug made from molds by impression takers. These are great when hearing protection is required at all times. And usually these will have some type of marking to distinguish between left or right. And again, they come with a protective case to store them in and directions for cleaning and maintenance. So again, these work great. If you wear hearing protection all day, you can put these in, they fit your ears, and you're going to have a good NRR rating because they in fact will be inserted correctly because they fit your ears. So great again for when hearing protection is required at all times. Another type that we see are the canal caps, and these use band tension to hold them in place. These are great for intermittent use. Perhaps if you're at the parts counter or at the order desk and you're going into the service shop or an area where there's loud exposures or levels of noise, you can wear these and go into that area, get the information you need, and come in and out with. So again, these are great for intermittent use. An area of concern that I see with these is because they are reusable, you pop them on and off. Sometimes people don't change out the tips as often as they should, and they often become very discolored and dirty. So again, just a reminder to be sure that you change those tips. Another point with these is I talked before about ensuring they're approved, because I see a lot of this type of hearing protection on the market that isn't approved. And one specific example was I was at a body shop and they had purchased these in a color that was branded to their organization. So it looked great. It matched their company issued uniforms that they were wearing, but unfortunately it wasn't approved, and they was since changed it out because it did not meet any type of approval rating. So always watch for that when you are purchasing hearing protection or any PPE for that matter, that it is approved by an applicable standard. Next off are the muffs, ear muffs. And these have ear cushions that are filled with foam, and they provide excellent sealing properties. Being that they're cushioned, it gives you a very comfortable fit, and the band ensures that it will fit the worker because you can expand or decrease the size by pulling the bars, those little metal bars, in and out from that black band, either upwards or downwards to extend or decrease that size. So these work great. They generally have a very high NRR rating, but in certain situations, you may still need to wear disposable plugs under your muffs, depending on your DBA or DBA Lex exposures. Then there's also the radio type of MP3 style of ear muffs. And these have a built-in safe volume control technology to maintain that safe DBA Lex value over an 8-hour workday. Just a word of caution is to ensure this type of hearing protection is okay or allowed by your employer, as some don't allow these in the workplace. So that hopefully gives you some different tips of the different types of hearing protection on the market. So as we talk about measuring noise and different pieces of equipment used, why do we measure noise in the workplace? Well, we need those measurements because they provide us with valuable information which describes and rates sound. We can use this to clearly identify where the sound is coming from and if it can cause hearing damage. So it's a great diagnosis tool to reduce noise exposures, because we can itemize those sources of noise. Measuring noise levels, it is the most important part of a hearing conservation program. As I was saying, you can itemize those sources of noise and you can focus on those area controls as necessary. And sometimes perhaps when we are doing this spot sampling of noise, volume controls and the different DBAs. So if I'm doing I could be doing a detailing area at a facility. So you may not be using a pressure washer or a shop vac, but because you are maybe wiping an interior on a piece of equipment or a vehicle, you could be exposed to high DBA levels. So therefore, when we are doing this type of equipment and with testing, we can determine how loud is that pressure washer or that shop vacuum. And you may not be using that equipment, but you're in that area. So that's where it gives you that valuable information on where the necessary controls can be utilized to help reduce that exposure. And I use that as an example because I find a lot of times the detailing area gets missed, especially around noise control and even protection of chemicals with the different industrial grade cleaners that people are using. But to stick to the webinar topic, I'll speak on the noise control. People are using shop vacuums and pressure washers for long periods of time. So they may not be as loud as power tools, but their exposure time is so great because they're using this all day. And generally we have our youngest workers or new workers in this area, and they are basically damaging their hearing. So I just give you that word of advice. If you have a detailing area at your dealership or facility in your organization, just to look at those noise levels, because it's generally with the pressure washer and shop vacuum, we're at that threshold based on exposure time that we need to be protecting our workers' hearing. But to get back to why the importance of measuring noise and the tools that we use, generally we use a sound level meter and a noise dose meter. And when you're using this type of equipment, ensure that you've received some sort of training if you're going to do this yourself, if you have this type of equipment, or have someone in like us that conduct this type of noise level testing. Because when you are going through it, you want to get the information and make sure that you can use this to itemize those sources of noise. And as mentioned, we can come to your facility and conduct this type of testing, whether it be sound level meter or noise dose meter. And I'll highlight those two types of equipment. I put a picture of a cell phone app on here measuring noise, not because it's something that I recommend, but I've seen sometimes people will use this. And generally, this can be used as a guide. So you can use this to see that, okay, it looks like we're over 80 decibels and we should have somebody come in here and do our noise testing with calibrated equipment. So again, that is an app that could be used as a guide, but it shouldn't be used as your main tool of noise measurement. Because as I was indicating, the calibration piece is very important to ensure that your equipment is calibrated at the manufacturer suggested by, or at the intervals suggested by the manufacturer. A couple of choices. If you have the equipment, you can do the calibrations in-house and document and log those calibrations, or you can send your device into the manufacturer to calibrate. So that's why there's an issue with the cell phone type of app. It is not calibrated, but it just gives you that approximate readout, which doesn't necessarily give you the full accurate information. So when you are getting your noise levels tested, it's important that the person uses calibrated equipment. And again, the importance of this, if your areas in your organization frequently exceed 80 dBA, your noise levels need to be measured. And if you've ever done perhaps a renovation at your facility, you may have built onto your shop or your organization, or have added or changed out different equipment, it's a good opportunity to get your noise levels tested. Even if we've done it before, those are times when it would warrant a retest of the noise levels if you've done that addition of equipment or building onto your organization. Noise level reports don't expire, but again, if you made those types of changes, that would be a good opportunity to have those noise levels retested. So I'm going to just review the different types of noise level testing equipment. The first one being the sound level meter, and that's seen on the picture on the slide. This consists of a microphone with electronic circuits and a readout display. The microphone detects the pressure variations associated with the sound and changes them into electrical signals. And then it reads out the display in decibels in the sound level meter. So again, this is great for that spot noise sampling. I come up to somebody who's using a shop vacuum and I can measure that decibel level. So I will hold that decibel meter extended in my arm, and I generally like to place it beside the worker's ear at their shoulder height. And by doing this, that's representing what that worker is hearing, because I'm at the same plane and the same height as what their ear is. And I'll generally turn it so that they can see it as well, so they get that readout of, wow, this is loud, and it gives them that awareness piece. So when we are measuring it, we can observe that equipment with the sound level meter. And with the sound level meter, they have what's called a response rate. And that's the time at which the instrument averages the sound level before displaying it on the screen. And these, you have the option of using fast or slow. You should always utilize that slow response scale when you are doing it or having it done at your organization. The sound level meter, again, it's great for that spot sampling for if we're measuring pieces of equipment or tools, but it doesn't give us the Lex value. It just does that spot sampling. But a tool that you can use or borrow or have done at your organization is the dose meter. And a dose meter measures and stores your sound pressure levels over a period of time. Generally, you give this to a worker, they'll slide it in their pocket, and they'll wear it for an 8-hour workday. And that will give you the true Lex value for that day. It may be necessary to wear this for repeated days because not every day is the same, and you can use the information when you use snapshot comparison day over day of those Lex values. So that is a great way of measuring what that exposure is to get the Lex value by having this worn by a worker. You can also do area Lex value measurement. So if you put this in a central area, perhaps in the detailing area, to measure what people are exposed to, but generally people wear this as a personal dose meter to get that type of Lex value measurement over the 8-hour day. So these are pretty popular. We've got a set of these in Regina and a set of these in Saskatoon, and they work great to get that Lex value determination. So if you're one of our members, we can do either sound level testing with a sound level meter or the dose meter. And once we do that, you'll see a report. And this is just a snapshot of a picture of what the dose meter report looks like. On the left, it shows you the decibel levels throughout the day. And at the bottom, it shows you the hours as the time passes throughout the day. It looks like this one stopped at about a 7.5-hour workday for what that may be what their work shift is. And the red squiggly line shows the noise exposure throughout the day. So as you can see, there's many peaks and drops throughout the course of the day. At some points, you could see that the noise level was over 85 decibels as it was up throughout the day. But you can also see the various rest and recovery breaks. Perhaps the person went home for lunch or took different micro breaks. And when you have rest and recovery periods between noise exposures, it brings down your Lex value or your dose towards the end of the day. As you can see, this came out with a dose of about 21% exposure throughout the course of the day. So that would be an example of there may be certain times that the worker may need to wear hearing protection throughout the day, but the dose is showing that they would have received approximately a 21-22% exposure rate. So again, this gives you some real information that you can use when you are determining perhaps different policy requirements at your organization. The other report that we use is this from our sound level meter, again, where we spot check different pieces of equipment. So we may have measured the pressure washer or different tools, as you could see on the slide, what the decibel level was. And then we survey that worker and ask them, how often do you use this tool or this piece of equipment during the day? And then we are able to determine the Lex value based on the exposure time that we're told, and the decibel recorded. And we can use our charts to determine what that Lex value is. So again, those are a couple different methods that are used. But no matter which method is used, you can use a combination of both. We still need to communicate and share that data. And we provide these orange decals. They're bright in color, and it allows you to document. For example, this 3/8 air impact wrench was measured at 103 decibels. And because the worker uses it for an hour per day, the decibel Lex value is 94 decibels. So again, hearing protection is obviously required with this piece of equipment. But with these decals, you can post them in the area that the worker is using the tool, or if possible, right on the equipment. So again, sharing that information, the regulations indicate you have to have your noise levels documented and posted if they're in excess of 80 dBA. So anytime you have us in at your organization, we'll give you a report. Good idea is you can laminate that report if you're going to put it into your organization in different environments that may be damaged in. We can always reprint a report for you if need be, or resend it to you. Keep a copy of this in your file. It should go into your hearing conservation program, which I'll be touching on in the coming slides. And again, as I was mentioning, sharing the noise levels by decaling. So if you have a forklift where you've recorded the decibel level, you can put that bright orange decal right on the dashboard or right on the shop vac. So again, sharing that information will make a great toolbox talk or to be included in a staff meeting. Now I'm going to switch over to the frequently asked questions section of the webinar and look at what kind of health effects can be caused by exposure to noise. Generally two types of health effects, the non-auditory effects and the auditory. So the non-auditory, this can include stress or physiological and behavioral effects. So even though we may not have experienced noise or hearing loss, it still caused increased stress levels and different physiological and behavioral effects just because we were exposed to noise. Then there's the actual auditory effects, which include that hearing impairment from noise exposure and the loss of that hearing over time because of that occupational exposure. So those are the two different causes of what we can see of health effects caused by exposure to noise. When we look at noise-induced hearing loss, as I indicated earlier in the webinar, this is a very cumulative process. And there are factors that determine hearing loss, such as the overall noise levels. What are we exposed to at the organization? What is the noise composition or the characteristics of the noise? That's going to have an impact on us as well. What's our exposure time during a typical workday? Or what happens outside of the workday? Do I crank up the music really loud? Do I go out, do a lot of hunting perhaps? So again, these are all factors looking at permanent losses of hearing. And also again, that exposure time for how long we were exposed to this based on years or days. Again, these are all factors or characteristics that are used for determining if this in fact was noise-induced hearing loss. Some other causes of hearing loss, again, as mentioned on a previous slide, excessive exposure to loud noise, or various infections can also cause hearing loss. Wax buildup. There may be scarring or damage to the eardrum, or even physical head injuries can be common causes of hearing loss. So again, not just excessive exposure to noise, as I said by the slide, different other factors can also cause hearing loss. And one that I didn't mention is aging. Hearing sensitivity also declines as people become older. Just like noise-induced hearing loss, not everyone's affected equally. So people can be affected, they can have the similar exposures, but people would have different ways it affects them. And that makes it difficult too for the WCB to accept noise-induced hearing loss claims. They are looking at what exposures do the people have when they were working in the workplace. Were there audiometric testing done? So do we know, did that hearing gradually decrease as that person worked at that organization? Did they use hearing protection? So there's a lot of things that the WCB weighs in as factors when they consider accepting hearing loss as a WCB claim. And aging is also looked at. If you've lost hearing due to aging, that's not a WCB related claimable type of occurrence, the fact that you've aged. But it looks at what your exposures were during the workplace. And that's why it's important to have those audiometric tests done so we can determine, did our noise levels of what we can hear through measurements of testing, has that decreased? So I'll be talking on that in the coming slides shortly when we look at the hearing conservation program. The sad part is when we look at any damage to our hearing, once it's lost, it doesn't come back. And I'm sure you've heard that said over and over. Tinnitus is the perception of ringing in your ears or clicking. And this affects 15 to 20% of people. It can be very uncomfortable. Just imagine if you've always heard ringing in your ears. This could be quite bothersome. It's been known to cause anxiety and in extreme situations, even suicide, with that constant ringing and clicking in your ears. So again, just a few points to remember also when we look at aging and how it affects hearing loss. I'll talk just briefly about our hearing conservation plan. And if you have 10 or more workers at your organization, and if your noise exposure there exceeds 85 dBA lex, a hearing conservation plan is required. And once you generate this plan, it needs to be reviewed and revisited every 3 years with your health and safety committee. So once you do the plan, it doesn't mean that you're done. Again, this needs to be reviewed and revisited. Good news is, if you do not have a hearing conservation plan, you will be sent one at the conclusion of this webinar. We drew up a plan that meets the Saskatchewan regulations, and it itemizes and highlights the areas that we see on this slide. So you can take that plan that you'll receive from us, and you may want to tweak or make any slight adjustments to it to fit your organization. But the hearing plan will highlight and cover all the areas focused on the slide, as they are a very important portion of what needs to be in that hearing conservation plan. And especially too, that it sets out that reminder and the requirement for the audiometric testing, as that's something that needs to be done every 2 years if you have exposure to 85 dBA lex or greater. So you can try to find or an organization that can come out to your location to do that on site, but just be sure that they are doing this they have soundproof equipment so that you get a quality test. That's what you want to ensure. And also, you can send your workers to have this done at a soundproof booth at an audiologist location. So I know geographically in Saskatchewan, there are some challenges around this to having their hearing conservation, that audiometric testing done every 2 years. So there are, again, those mobile companies that come out. Just be sure that they are, in fact, utilizing good soundproof equipment if they are coming on site to do that test for you. But again, it's a piece that sometimes gets missed, so that's why I'm emphasizing it. So good closing thought. Once hearing loss from noise exposure occurs, it can never be reversed or repaired. You gradually lose it, and it's just slowly reducing over time your ability to hear. So protect what you have of your hearing now. It's not too late to start. And that's sometimes so frustrating. We go to a facility, people are banging away on the power tools, not wearing hearing protection, and they say, well, I'm going to lose my hearing anyway. They've gradually accepted it. So let's not accept that. Let's challenge ourselves. Where do we go from here? Have you had your noise levels tested? Let's start there. We come out at no additional charge for our membership in the province and do that noise level testing. Look within your organization, or if you're doing any changes or expansion, are you sourcing the quietest possible equipment? Do you have a hearing protection rule or policy in place? So I'm sure every one of you on this webinar today, your organizations are in different places in this possible program based on the questions I asked. So there's going to be an opportunity. So I challenge you to look at that opportunity and move forward with it. I will be providing you with a lot of samples and templates to help you in this journey. I've got safe work practice on excessive noise. I've got a great hearing conservation guide I will be sending out. I've got that template on the hearing conservation program. That'll save you a lot of work. You can utilize that, make it fit your organization. There's toolbox talks I will send, fact sheets on DBA levels, as well as that Lex value chart. And as always, webinar attendees and participants will be receiving a certificate at the end of this webinar. So watch for that. As well as you'll see a short survey to offer feedback on today's webinar and also suggest future topics. Because we always like to give a webinar a value of a topic that you are looking for. And we always post these webinars to our website, and this is no exception. So this concludes today's webinar on noise exposure and hearing loss. Just a quick reminder, if you do have questions, if you have not entered them in, just please enter them now into the chat box, enter your questions, and they will be answered at the conclusion of the webinar via email. Or if you prefer to pick up the phone, give us a call, any one of our advisors. We can help you and answer any questions you may have, or we can book in a on-site noise level testing or dose meter testing. Or if you prefer to email us or go to our website for further resources, those opportunities are available as well. So again, I'd like to thank you for your time in joining me in today's webinar on noise exposure and hearing loss.